Okay, so admittedly, this is one of my pet peeves, how to properly address the presiding officer of a legislative body. There are two areas of confusion regarding properly addressing the presiding officer of a legislative committee or on the floor. In committees, the presiding officer may be addressed by fellow legislators, advocates, or members of the general public. On the floors, of course, the presiding officer is only addressed by fellow legislators. But in both instances, there sometimes is confusion about how to properly do so and what rules are applicable. The rules of the California legislature provide some guidance, as do Mason's legislative manual. Generally, where the legislature's rules are silent, Mason's manual applies. In fact, Assembly Rule 10 states Mason's manual, in all cases not provided for by the California Constitution or by the Assembly rules, by the joint rules of the Senate and Assembly, or by statute, the authority is the latest edition of Mason's manual. Similarly, Senate Rule 21.5 provides essentially the same, and Joint Rule 31 deals with authority when rules do not govern, and note that they're governed by the latest edition of Mason's manual. So what does Mason's manual provide to guide us in these instances? Well, in the Mason's legislative manual, chapter 13, it's titled Conduct of Debate, and section 110 deals specifically with addressing members or the presiding officer. And it provides these four main provisions. Section 1, all debate must be addressed to the presiding officer and not to the members. Section 2, to guard against the appearance of personalities in debate, it has long been the rule in legislative bodies that no member should refer to another by name in debate. The other member should be described by the district he or she represents, the seat in their house, or the member who spoke last, or in any similar manner that does not use the legislator's name. Section 4 says the presiding officer of a house of a state legislature is always addressed as Mr. Speaker or Madam Speaker or Mr. President or Madam President. And in committee, it's Mr. Chair or Madam Chair. And in section 5 of Mason's manual, the officers of a deliberative body should always be referred to by their official titles. So what happens on the floors of the Assembly and Senate? Well, those watching or listening to the Assembly or Senate floors in the California State Legislature sometimes ask why legislators do not refer to each other by their names. First, at the commencement of discussion of a bill, the legislature addresses the presiding officer. As a result, each Assembly member begins his or her presentation, or should do so, on the floor in the Assembly, for example, as Mr. Speaker or Madam Speaker, depending on who is presiding. Likewise, each senator begins his or her presentation on the Senate floor with Mr. President or Madam President, depending on who is presiding. And again, this is in accordance with section 1 of section 110 of Mason's manual, which says all debate must be addressed to the presiding officers and not to the members. By the way, Assembly Rule 108 also specifies when a member desires to address the assembly, so the full body, the member shall rise from the member's seat and respectfully address the presiding officer as Mr. Speaker or Madam Speaker. Also, consult Senate Rule 35, which has two provisions that are applicable here. It is titled Regulations as to Speaking. First, when a senator desires to address the Senate, the senator shall rise at the senator's desk and address the presiding officer. Also, later on in Rule 35, a senator may not be interrupted when speaking, and no question may be asked of the senator except through the presiding officer. Second, regarding reference to a fellow legislator on the floor of the Assembly or Senate, remember that section 2 of section 110 of Mason's manual is clear. It actually gives 3 examples as to a fellow legislator's district or the geographic region that they represent. Again, It makes clear that no legislator should refer to another legislator by name in a legislative debate. How about in committees? There are rules and protocols for addressing legislators sitting on committees, and in both houses, the three officers of a standing committee are the chair, the vice chair, and the secretary. Of course, the chair presides at a meeting, except when the committee is considering a bill for which the chair is the sole author or the lead author of the bill. And whenever the chair is not presiding at the committee hearing, then the vice chair has to assume the duties of the chair. And in the absence of both the chair and vice chair, then a member is designated by the chair who then presides. So when a fellow legislator addresses a committee or an advocate or member of the public does, the individual should begin the presentation with either Mr. Chair or Madam Chair, depending on the gender of the chair. One other point, when you appear before a committee, sometimes there's some confusion when the vice chair is presiding. The committee vice chair presides again in the place of the committee chair when either the chair is presenting his or her own bill or when the chair is absent for all or part of the hearing. In these cases, the vice chair is, in fact, the chair, and he or she presides and has actually assumed the role of committee chair and therefore should be addressed as such. In other words, sometimes folks are confused, such as advocates or even fellow legislators, when they address the vice chair who's currently presiding as Mr. Vice Chair or Madam Vice Chair. That is incorrect. Because the vice chair is acting in place of the chair and is presiding over the committee hearing, the vice chair is no longer the vice chair. He or she is the presiding officer and in fact is the acting chair. This means that when the vice chair is chairing the committee, that individual should be properly addressed as Mr. Chair or Madam Chair.